Ko te pū, te mori, te weu, te aka, te rea. Ko te wao nui, te kune, te whē, te kore, te pō. Ki ngā tangata, nā rangi rawa ko papa, ko tēnei te tīmatanga o te ao. E rongo, whakairi ake ki ronga, tūturu whakamaua ki a tīnā, tīnā. Aume, hui, tai ki e. Me mihi ka tika ki a koutou katoa. Nau mai, whakatau mai rā. I need to start with some housekeeping. Just to remind you that this webinar is going to be recorded and that after the weekend it'll be put up on YouTube. So that's in its entirety. So please ensure that your video function is off if you've got any worries about the privacy aspect of going onto YouTube. And you can also consider how you might want to set your name up if you're worried about that as well. So, thanks for being here, everyone. My name's John Tovey. I'm a tangata tiriti with ancestry from Scotland, England, and Ireland. My long life's been blessed in many ways by involvement with te ao Māori. Nō reira, me mihi ka tika ki ngā iwi Māori katoa o te motu nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. So I'm part of a group within Extinction Rebellion called Pathway to Survival. We've heard of the passing yesterday of renowned kaumātua and educator Tā Toby Curtis of Ngāti Kuri and Ngāti Rongomai, now lying at his home near Lake Rotoiti. We acknowledge the sense of sadness and loss settling throughout the motu at the news of this recent passing of another outstanding and respected leader, so soon after the passing of Moana Jackson. We extend our whakaaro aroha to the whānau, hapu, iwi and colleagues who are grieving for him. Oti mauri mate, ka huri anō tātou ki tonga ora, ki te ao marama, ki ora mai tātou katoa. Now, a bit more about us as a group. So we are ex-Aotearoa members, and we're well informed about the interlocked global crises of warming climate, ecosystem collapse, and ongoing wealth inequality. I'm sure a lot of people on this list share that knowledge. We are also conscious of the festering injustice that has resulted from centuries of colonial-led capitalist exploitation on a global scale, from which many in Aotearoa continue to benefit. Sorry about that background noise. Over recent months, we've been looking closely at the big transformational changes that need to be made if we are to survive in our communities here in Aotearoa and also honour our role as responsible global citizens. We see tiriti justice and greatly increased awareness of global Indigenous rights and their ancestral knowledge as a crucial part of those changes. So it is a terrific pleasure and a delight that we have Catherine with us tonight, and we want to thank Catherine and Tor for being able to put together the interview that we're about to have a look at. Catherine of Te Rarawa and Ngāti Kuri has been on this waka for a very long time. Her intellect and her animated, hard-out advocacy for the Indigenous and global values she holds dear are renowned throughout Aotearoa and Te ao Moana, the Pacific world, and indeed the globe itself, as a result of her work for United Nations. She also has a great history of being involved in the early days of the Mātiki Mai project, when Moana Jackson and Margaret Mutu were getting set up. She was a project manager back in those days. That's been a long time in gestation, but it'll be part of, hopefully it's something we'll be talking about tonight. So from there is a little more housekeeping. So you'll notice that the chat stream is open, and it'll be open while the interview is playing. And you just as if you're in a normal Zoom webinar, you could talk to each other, see who's there while you're listening, and you can think about questions for Catherine. If you've got a question for her, please put a Q at the top of your chat. And if you feel like it, you could put something about your name, where you're from, and maybe your organisation in with the question as well. But that's just a matter of choice. If you're comfortable to do that. So that's the plan at this stage. Following the interview, which should take about 40 minutes, there'll be a period of question and answer. So we anticipate formally closing the webinar and freeing Catherine up about 8:30 p.m. But after that, there will be an opportunity if people want to linger and hang out in a gallery type view situation for maybe till 9 o'clock. So that's where that's the sort of map out that we're anticipating. And I think my job now is to hand it back to Sally to kick off the interview. So thank you. Ngā mihi ki a koutou katoa.
Kia ora, Catherine. Yeah, good to have you here. We're looking at treaty justice and co-governance. Sometimes we get people saying, why should we worry about that? We're supposed to be a climate action movement. So what's it got to do with climate action? I mean, people are still saying that, but I think I want to, yeah, what's your take on it?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, actually. I know what you mean when people are like, why are we bothering with, I don't get it. So from my perspective, right, if you imagine, so here's Te Tiriti justice, this little dot. What that is justice for Māori people in Aotearoa, okay? But it's really a micro of something bigger, which is Indigenous people's justice. Imagine a bigger circle that's outside of it, okay? Mm-hmm. But imagine a bigger circle outside of that, which is human rights, yeah?
Yeah.
And imagine, keep going, imagine a bigger circle, it sits within, outside of that. And that's like, I don't know, these are just labels, but you could call that earth justice if you want. Mm-hmm. Okay? You can even go beyond that, but I'll just stop it there. So you can see there is actually a track to treaty justice, and within all of those concentric circles and spaces, there will be environmental justice, climate justice, and all that sort of thing. So that's one way of looking at the relevance of it. Another way is, of course, under Te Tiriti, all of our taonga were guaranteed to us, including our forests, our fisheries, blah, blah, blah. And of course, because, you know, taonga is a very, like, it's a subject which wasn't specifically elaborated in Te Tiriti. It means a lot of things that weren't specifically mentioned in Te Tiriti, but anything that's precious to us, that we value, those things need to be protected. That's what was guaranteed, after all, to us. And of course, that's anything in the environment, biodiversity. It includes our atua dimensions as well. Ranginui, everything to do with the sky. Tāwhiri, everything to do with the weather. Papatuanuku, you know, the land, you know, the whenua. So you can easily start to see, if you create justice with the Te Tiriti issues for Māori and tangata whenua, there'll naturally be some spillover, there'll naturally be some overlap. And another dimension too, there's a lot, but another dimension too is, and this is something common with Indigenous peoples everywhere pretty much, the patriarchal nature of the world today. You know, patriarchy is very destructive, it's very egoic, very controlling, exploitative, all that sort of thing. So many Indigenous peoples are actually matriarchal values based, you know, very feminine in their culture, their belief systems and such, which is a lot about protecting nature, actually, not destroying her. So that's a bonus when you get to protect, you know, Te Tiriti rights. You're getting all this bonus stuff in there, which is the values that go with, in practice, protecting Te Tiriti and the guarantees under that instrument. You're actually, you know, it's the culture of Māori which you're protecting as well, and that's a value system which is all about mitigating in the climate crisis. Any crisis, actually, for that matter, could be a social one, economic one, a political one. So that's another aspect. And I'll just mention one more, which is related to the value system, and I already gave a hat tip to it with the atua, the gods. Gods, that's I guess it's a Western sort of idea. Again, we're looking for labels because there isn't something that's you know, perfectly translatable to atua. But another way of looking at atua are our ancestors, our supernatural ancestors, because Māori believe we derive from our ancestors, supernatural ones included, Ranginui, Papatuanuku, going right back to Io Matua Kore, Io the parentless one. And when you take that big picture of everything being your kin, your whanaunga, your relation, I mean, come on. What else are you going to do but protect them? You know, if everyone just took on this sort of, you know, put on this sort of suit of that thinking, that mindset, that heart set, actually, would be home and hose. Wouldn't even have a problem. So, you know, that's just a few reasons. And so, yeah, climate crisis, yeah, we could, if we were in a proper conversation, respectful, mana enhancing, you know, we could nut out what needs to be done quite easily. I'm grossly oversimplifying, but at another level I'm not, because to us it does seem quite straightforward. To heal, it's all about healing and balance. So that's another very important value with Māori. In this world there must be balance. You know, you have a wairua side, a metaphysical side, some might call it spiritual side, and you have a molecular physical side, and they must be balanced. But you think of any other dichotomy in our world, everything has to be in balance, and that's why we have crises, because of things are out of balance, right? So yeah, that's my preliminary response to your question of why should we bother with Te Tiriti justice. You know, you know, it's that thing. People will recognise this: a rising tide lifts all boats. You know, that idea that if you have anyone in your society that is under the thumb and oppressed, and injustices are, you know, routinely being perpetrated against them, you don't really have a just society. You don't really have a society that's you can be happy to live in. Yeah. Taking care of the vulnerable people in your society too is a very good indicator, or, you know, a bad indicator if you're letting vulnerable people, you know, always you know, having their rights violated. That's a bad sign for your country. So you want to protect those who are vulnerable, you know, disabled, women, children, minorities, elderly, Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, yeah. That's really helpful. I think it's also, I was going to ask a second question about how will this be good for tau iwi, non-Māori, and I I've experienced the answer myself in terms of that process of I've been thrown back on looking at our values. It's the importance of values, and the values looking back in our own Eurocentric history, and finding the correspondences, finding the commonalities, and it's like really, really important. It's so important these days. Yeah, I agree. I mean, we might have different cultures, skin color, but even think of any separatenesses as age, gender, you know, all of that. It's just an illusion, really. When you come down to it, we're all humans, and when you push out beyond that, we're all earthlings. Now, that should be enough in common to want to help one another. Actually, one of the other beliefs common amongst Māori peoples is, fractal. That is to say, I am you and you are me when it comes down to it. That's why, many of us will be aware of those, the legal personality that has been accorded to the Whanganui River and the Uruwaras, the national park. It's been legislated in treaty settlements that they have legal personality, so they're protected like people. And hey, all good, because hey, if corporations can have blinking legal personality and go to court and protect their privileges, they shouldn't have legal personality, in my humble opinion, because they're abusing that, making their legal personality even superior to actual humans' rights, which is an abomination. But to use that framework for landscapes or ecosystems or whatever in nature, I think it's a good thing to have in our toolkit. We need everything we can to protect them. It's not a silver bullet though, but it helps. But I am you, I'm the river's me, I'm the maunga, the mountain is me. It's something we actually believe because they're our ancestors. And if people really took that on, that understand, they wouldn't need to be forced or compelled to act. They would just do it out of a sense of duty, obligation, love. In practical terms, what are other ways that we can support Te Tiriti justice? And as mostly focusing on climate, what's the best forms of support?
In no particular order, there's a lot that we can do. I am a strong advocate for getting our school curriculums fit for purpose. Fit for purpose, what is that? Well, you can define that however you want to, but we do need more awareness of the climate issues and some, meaningful responses that we, as not just as individuals, but as communities and society, can, take. So that's one thing that I reckon needs doing. A lot of people think this is something that needs doing, is tailoring our curriculum to make sure that we are fortifying our young people with the information, the data, the wisdom, the critical thinking ability. Not just, to hear something, the establishment narrative, and just, robotically believe it. Think for yourself. So that's one thing. But the other side of education, of course, is, and this is sad that it was kicked down the road for another year, but the true history of this nation in terms of the relationship between tangata whenua and the Crown, that should be stock standard, and it isn't. And that's because it is not, people have a very ignorant perspective of how our country came to be, how it was created, where we're at and where we ought to be going, where we've come from and where we ought to be going, and how it involves them as, Pākehā and Tauiwi, what relevance it has to them to understand this nation's history. If our curriculum was calibrated correctly and had the content to understand our history, there'd be more tolerance and understanding, I believe, between the different people in this country. And I think racism would start melting away once you really understood what happened in our country's past.
Yeah.
So that would help. It helps to just sort of open the hearts and minds of people to a new paradigm and way of, and value system, obviously. There should be bilingualism in Aotearoa. It should be mandatory in my view, because again, when you learn the reo, the language, it's the reo me ona tikanga, it's the language and the customs and practices. And you can't help but just be colonized by Māori values. And that's a good thing, because colonization has been a very bad thing, not just for Aotearoa, not just for the Pacific region, but for the whole blinking world. So yeah, we need to reclaim our history and let it be like everyone's history. They own it, they can claim it, and we can move forward together in our, shared, future creating. I reckon that would be awesome. Another thing, at the moment there is a public consultation that's happening. The government is implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's asking the question, how do we do that? And I would encourage as many people as possible to contact, if you haven't already heard about the logistics and how this consultation is happening, contact the Ministry of Māori Development, Te Tiriti, and say, oi, I want to be on the emailing list to get notifications about this. I want to go. I want to know where my local meeting is happening about this. And then, of course, you go. And you get to, because there will be obviously linkages with Te Tiriti justice, with the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there are lots of resources too. If people want to go onto the Te Tiriti website and look for the Declaration web page in there, I'm sure you'll be able to navigate there fairly easily. There's a whole lot of resources you should be able to find there, including a summary of the first phase of the consultation, which was just with tangata whenua. The government just talked with tangata whenua. It was a bit of a hoha, it was a bit frustrating, because they asked us, what's important to us and how do we see this be? And we're like, jingos, if you don't know that already, you guys ain't been paying attention, or you've been willfully blind. So we'll tell you again. But there's a summary in there of what that consultation feedback was. And that'd be good to bring everyone up to speed on at least the basics.
Was that related to the He Puapua document?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that the one?
That's one of the resources that will be in amongst. Yeah, good one. Yeah.
Good.
So
I'll make sure those links are in the chat on the webinar time.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, so for those who don't know, Te Puapua, or He Puapua, sorry, it was a document that was put together by a group of experts, academics, Māori thinkers, leading thinkers on, what is important to implement Te Tiriti and Indigenous rights. And also it will have mentioned Māteke Mai Aotearoa, which is the Independent Constitutional Working Group. And they have a lot of thoughts about co-governance and such. I was a part of that group. I helped project manage that at the start of the that initiative. And that was published in 2016, their report back. But all this is connected. So yeah, that's another practical thing I would do. Just educate yourself where you can. If you can pick up a bit of the reo, that will help. That will help, because there are naturally some words that are really they're just significant, like aroha is a good one. If you know what aroha really means, it just doesn't mean only love or compassion. It means like ha is the breath of life. Aro means, like, it references aroaro, which is to pay attention to, really focus on something. And if you put those two ideas together, when you focus on your breath, it's like a form of meditation. And for anyone who knows what meditation can do, It connects you with the universe. It connects you with your higher self. And once you're connected with your higher self, you'll have a different way of looking at the world. You will be more compassionate and understanding all the rest of it. And that's good for climate crisis by Jingos.
Yes.
But also the little word "ah" is that every sound in the language has a harmonic frequency, like energetic, like vibrational frequency. Ah is like that sound when you think of oh, eureka, oh, aha. It's about realization, it's about enlightenment. So Aroha's got an ah at the start and it's got an ah at the end. I mean, we could go on about just this one word, but it all links back to climate crisis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You understand the Māori language, and you'll get
Yeah.
a lot of why it's important to protect the language and the culture and the Te Tiriti and climate crisis.
Yeah. Great. Do you want to talk a bit about the Pacific and how what's happening in the Pacific is important to climate activists in Aotearoa?
Sure. Yeah, so it's a bit like, you know, the Russian dolls nested in one another, isn't it, really? So Aotearoa is part of the Pacific. They're our family. Hello. So, you know, people talk a lot about, oh, you know, we've got to mitigate and adapt to climate crisis because, you know, we have to avert the crisis and catastrophe. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It's already happening, man. There are people in our Pacific who, especially on like atolls and small island nations, we like to refer to ourselves as large ocean states, actually, rather than focusing on the small part, we'll focus on the big part. And there are some communities in the Pacific already who can't live on their traditional territories any longer. And I mean, people maybe don't appreciate it's not just about sea level rise. Like, you know, it is a bit about that, of course, when you've got severe weather events, you know, hurricanes and such. I mean, you will have the sea level rise with king tides and big waves will ruin, you know, small defenseless islands in the Pacific. But even when the weather is more stable, the increments of sea level rise and such is salinating the island's aquifers they need for fresh water. That alone means it's unlivable there because it starts getting into the soil that is in the islands. You can't grow food because the plants can't handle that much salt in the soil or whatever. So, you know, there are whole communities having to uproot themselves and move somewhere. Now, where are they going to go? We have to welcome our brothers and sisters. We have to open up Aotearoa for, you know, as many as we can take, because where else are they going to go? And they're our whānau. They're our family. But that should make people think, okay, so we have, you know, our culture here in Aotearoa, and these people have their own culture, and they have a human right to retain their culture, maintain their culture, and their nationhood, their status as a nation. And you can think about things like, oh, wait a minute, what about, you know, the international open water high seas treaties? Who gets rights? Who can go fishing? You know, if their little nation is no longer because it's underwater, does that mean all of the water around their island is now open slather for anyone who wants to fish there? You know, so this is a conversation that's happening too. What happens with the territories of these communities? Do they lose them legally? And these Pacific Islanders are saying, hell no, this wasn't our climate crisis. We didn't cause this. So why should we lose our territories? No, we should maintain our exclusive economic zones around our islands, even though they're going underwater. And I guess the question then becomes, well, how are we going to help them enforce their their territories, which are now just ocean and no land, so that they're not overfished, you know, so that companies don't come in on the sly and ruin the deep sea by, you know, scraping off all those nodules, minerals and stuff, deep sea mining and that sort of thing. There's so much that could happen if those islanders aren't there, those Pacific peoples aren't there to keep an eye out for their taonga.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, we have to ensure that their culture, their human right to culture is protected. And when they come here, you know, we have kohanga reo, we have our Māori language nests, you know, we have to support them to keep their language alive, because there's a crisis with Indigenous languages being lost around the world. Now you might think, well, what do I care? You should care, not just you four, but people, the audience should care, because with that culture and language is knowledge. Now let's remember, is it around 80% of the world's biodiversity is actually under the protection and management of Indigenous peoples. What's left of natural biodiversity, and we manage our, generally speaking, comparatively to the Western world, the disaster capitalist exploitative system, Indigenous people manage our natural environments really well. And one reason is because our survival depends on it. So, but you don't just manage that stuff. You have a whole culture, a whole language, a lexicon, and traditions and practices that go with your forest or your wetlands or your mountain areas or whatever it is, your deserts, your rivers. And when we lose the language, we lose the practices. When you lose the practices, you lose all of that, you know, caring for it's out, it's gone, lost. So that's why we must, and by the way, this is the decade, it began this year, the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, you know. Not that Indigenous peoples necessarily need a United Nations or whatever decade, but hey, it helps to shine a light on the importance for the world, whether you're Indigenous or not, the importance, because it's just like diversity in the biosphere, diversity in the cultural sphere. It's just like that. We can't, if you want to just colonize the planet so everyone's talking the same language and looking the same and acting the same, it'll be a dead planet before too long. The coronavirus showed us that the diversity in people's genetic makeup, diversity of age, diversity in, you know, how our body, our constitutions and such, that meant you have different responses in people to the virus. That's important, because if we were all the same, built the same, one virus that latched onto that sameness and could attack that sameness would wipe out our species. You need diversity. So everyone should be super, you know, concerned with protecting Indigenous peoples in all regards.
Wow. Is anything else you want to? The last thing I was wondering about was how the struggle for the Indigenous people's struggle relates to the broader global South and what's happening there. Do you want to say a bit about that, or?
Well, I guess it's the macro, another macro that we could, you know, you just transplant, sort of swap out Māori for Fijian, and it's just the same scenario, different community. You could do that with the global South as well for any community there. But again, a lot of the global South, like on the South America, for example, they're part of the Pacific. We consider them to be our family too. If anyone thinks of like, oh, the Kumara, that has an ancestry, a whakapapa that goes to South America. That's been shown to be true. Yeah, elements of our culture do track back to there. So again, on that level alone, they're our family. But on another level, a lot of like what we need for a healthy climate is in the global south. Think of all the forests that are, you know, the lungs of the planet. One of the lungs, the ocean is probably the bigger one, but the one, stuff on land, seems to be what people care about a lot, because you can see it. You can't see what's underwater, but you can see the trees burning and the smoke and and people fleeing, you know, sensationalize all that sort of stuff. It's drama. But we need to protect those in the global south, and like in the Pacific, they're the ones who have least contributed to the climate crisis, but they're the first to be harmed. And yeah, they're just paying the biggest price. The harm that they're impacted by, it's more hurtful, harmful to them, because a lot of the global south don't have that wealth that the global north has. So they don't have the same capacity to respond, to protect their people and what they value. Now that's a major injustice, major injustice. And this thing about, you know, again, balancing out, okay, who's most responsible for creating this crisis? That's, you know, in very, you know, broad terms, the global north. That's where Europe is. That's where America is, you know. So the more developed countries, the richer nations, there's a correlation with wealth and also theft and colonization, right?
Yeah.
So there's like some kind of debt that is owed to those who have been colonized, and many of them are in the global south. So, you know, people ought to be thinking of these bigger pictures of justice, because if we can focus on achieving justice in these areas that we've been talking about, for Māori, in the Pacific, for the global south, as the people, you will find there's a correlation with healing of the planet. It's really basic. If we can get that one idea in our head, justice equals healing. So, well, it sets us on a path. It doesn't equal immediately, but we really have to focus on justice. Because you're not going to get, you know, meaningful climate mitigation, adaptation without it. You're just going to get more of the same, which is the status quo, which is just continuing on this insane, you know, life-destroying death journey that we're going on. It's really a crisis of consciousness. And so a lot of the global south, Indigenous communities, you know, live there too. So it's interesting how, you know, Indigenous peoples having, you know, a strong sense of wairuatanga, spirituality, you know, metaphysical connection with the universe and everything. And yet, then in the global north, you have this disconnection. So what the people of the global south are screaming to those in the global north, if we can be really reductionist about it, it's oversimplified, but it's, you know, people just have to reconnect to nature and one another, and values that are life nurturing, not life destroying. It's really simple. But the question then becomes, well, how do you actually implement that? Because we have this juggernaut of a framework in a, you know, system, which is the economic market-based capitalistic system. And I won't call it a capitalist system, because a capitalist system would look different than today. What we've got is, you might have heard the phrase, socialism for capitalists. You know what I mean? Yeah. What's your concept of that before I...
benefiting the people who already got stuff.
Yeah, like
those in power.
subsidizing
Yeah.
corporations.
Yeah.
The only reason a lot of, agricultural sector, fossil fuels, different corporations, operations and such is because they get massive subsidies from governments. And let me remind people, that's not an abstract thing. Government's money is your taxes. You should be very, very offended to know that your money is going towards the military industrial complex, it's going towards fossil fuel subsidies, it's going towards, industrial agricultural subsidies. Are you not upset by that? I am. Holy moly. So, how are we going to bring down the system is, well, believe it or not, many Indigenous peoples have been fighting for our rights. Like, I'm talking like actually guerrilla warfare, whatever, taking up arms or just putting their lives on the line for their communities to just survive. Now, the mainstream media won't show you a lot of this. They'll just filter the stuff that, I don't know, who's, telling the mainstream media what to show on nightly news, but there is a whole lot going on, and there has been for generations, of Indigenous peoples defending the earth.
Yeah.
So, the rest of us have to catch up, get with the program, and figure out, okay, how are we going to mobilize what they've been doing?
Yeah.
You might want to go and do some research, maybe find some films if you like watching movies, you're not really into reading books, or if you like listening to podcasts, whatever, floats your boat. But go and read up or educate yourself on some of the Indigenous peoples' movements in history, how they defended their territories, their environments, their water, their lands, their people, and have a think about, just reflect on, okay, how can we take some of the learning from them and apply it now here in Aotearoa? And we've got some great examples in Aotearoa. Heck, just go and watch the Finna movie, for crying out loud. That's a good place to start. It's on theatres now, it's out there. But there's many others. Everyone knows about Gandhi, for example. Or go to some of the civil rights, the black people in America. They've got a lot in common with us, Indigenous peoples. They were once Indigenous and they were stolen peoples and taken, slavery. So, do some research of your own, get inspired, and then find other people who are like-minded, who care about their kids and their grandkids, because that's really what's at stake. There's no future for our kids. There ain't. So do we care that there ain't? And, you'll find a lot of the Indigenous peoples just, we don't, who cares about what the government law is? The law is unjust. We do not recognize unjust law. It's killing the planet. Why would we recognize it? No, we're radically obedient to higher law. You have to be. That's the mindset you have to have. Radical obedience to higher law. And by higher law, I mean law that, is life nurturing.
Which brings it round to where we started in lots of ways, isn't it? It's like changing our values, reaching inside and changing how we look at the world. Yeah. And then we can come together. Seems to me. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Heaps,
but I mean, I might, if those are the key questions, you wanted to discuss, or ideas you wanted to discuss, I'm happy to leave it there and see what questions our audience has. I know a lot of this sounds like really, that sounds really, kind of lovey-dovey and romanticized maybe, or, it's not, people might think, it's not really practical what you're talking about, the metaphysical ideas and aroha and, values and whatever. But I tell you, if we can comprehend the foundation of everything, and if you need a bit more evidence about the value of metaphysics, go do some research on quantum physics. If you don't believe Indigenous peoples knew about quantum physics first, and I always joke about this, it's not a competition, but we just did. And scientists, so-called scientists, are laggards. They're just catching up to us now. Why do you think it is that scientists go around and steal, you know, our genetic material? You know, they turn it into pharmaceuticals and they sell it with, you know, they go talk to Indigenous peoples about, oh, what's the medicinal plants that you guys have in your forest? And because we're such lovely people, we tell them, and then they go and commodify it and make lots of money of it. Why do you think they come to us? It's because we know. Go look at quantum physics. The science tells us that, you know, we are living in almost like an illusory world. The molecular world is actually underpinned by a quantum world, which is meta physics, not molecular physics. So yeah, that's why it's so important to get in touch with your consciousness, your wairuatanga and all of that, because the answers, and let's face it, a lot of what's going on, you can't logic your way out of this. It's too complex. That's why you have to go to metaphysics and that wisdom, that is deep wisdom, to, you know, navigate our way out of this. It's the only way out now, because we're too far gone. You're not going to intellectualize your way out of this. You can't techno-fix your way out of it. That's the last thing I would say.
Thank you, Catherine. That's really great.
Thank you. We should have more chats like this.
Yes, it's great. Yeah. Okay. Kia ora.
Thank you, Catherine. And Tor. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how many people can hear me. You all right? Now, possibly not a, you know, that was a wide-ranging and 100 challenges. That was a jam-packed conversation, that's for sure. And personally, I found it really interesting. I noticed from our 21 attenders that they're being slow to come forward with actual questions. And I wonder if we should consider seeing some of the people there, whether we should pass the rākau out a bit, or whether we want to revisit some questions of our own. Is there any thoughts from our fellow co-hosts to how we should proceed from here? What's this? Lance, a comment from Lance. Oh, no, hang on, it's a comment from Kaz. We do have a question. A question for you from Kaz. Is there progress at the United Nations on Indigenous rights? For example, the court cases. So over to you, Kaz.
Thanks, John, and Kaz for that question. Let me start by saying what might we consider the definition of progress to mean. The first answer is yes. There are, for example, 9 core human rights treaties, and you don't have to be only Indigenous to avail yourself of these treaties. If I have a chance, I might be able to find a website which it's like a portal to those 9 human rights treaties, and each of those treaties have mechanisms by which civil society can make complaints directly to a committee of experts. So that is violating your human rights. And human rights includes the right to a healthy environment. And there's also development of jurisprudence, which is to say the legal standards around the different human rights, and they're evolving constantly. So human rights around climate crisis and the right to a healthy environment extends out to the climate as well. We've also seen at the International Court of Justice, there have been class action lawsuits against states. The one I have in mind is, I think it was a Dutch civilians. There's like 800 civilians joined together, and they sued their government, and the basic gist of it was the government wasn't doing enough to keep emissions down. They won their case. So hey, precedent for countries all around the world, and I do believe here this isn't a UN case, but does anyone know of Mike Smith's case to the Supreme Court here in Aotearoa, right?
Yeah.
So he's suing 7, is it, different corporates for their emissions. So, you know, back in the day, I just want to sort of say, back in the day, protesting had a particular kind of flavor. Get out on the streets, rah, 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 placards, rah, 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 rah. I think many corporate actors, governments have become just desensitized to that, quite frankly. And you know how those with power, you know, there's that saying, those with power, they don't give up their power willingly. You got to force them. And the courts seem to be now a good track to force those people and entities with power to change their behavior. It's, again, there isn't any silver bullet. If any of you are looking for a silver bullet, you're not going to find it. The situation is so complex, you need a multiplicity of actions, like coming at all angles. It is election year, remember, coming up. So again, this is another way that we can put the thumb screws on those with power and influence. And when just circling back to the UN system, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I saw a link put in the chat to that declaration. Now, the declaration isn't a treaty. The declaration is what we call soft law. You can't use it like directly to force states to comply with the standards in that instrument. But when the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is incorporated into domestic law, and you'll see some examples of that around the world, then the courts in our own countries can start using that to set standards that governments have to comply with. So this is why I say, you would have heard me say in that interview, that if you can engage with the government consultation on implementing the rights of Indigenous peoples, and you put the pressure on them to do that in New Zealand, you're moving the bar, you're nudging the bar along a little bit, you know. When I was a negotiator for the Ngāti Kuri historical treaty claims negotiations with our government, we sought to have the declaration included in our settlement legislation, and the New Zealand government just flat out refused. So, you know, if more of civil society knew about the declaration, then maybe we could, you know, force the government to give it the recognition it deserves. And we only have a short window of time to do these things. So, you know, let's get to it, is what I'd like to say. I hope that's an answer to your question. Kaz, was it Kaz?
It was Kaz. We've got another good question here, which I'll read out to you. What's the best way we could support the Global South nations for their call for cancellation of their debts to the IMF and the World Bank?
The
Good
best
question.
way, yeah. If anyone else has thoughts, please feel free to chime in. I follow global economic trends and stuff because it affects everything. But I'm not an expert in that. The best way to support them, look, would be to ask them what do they need from us. There's this principle of free, prior and informed consent. You'll see that in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Free, prior and informed consent. Anything, any policy, any state or corporate action that is proposed or is done that impacts on Indigenous peoples anywhere, those impacted Indigenous communities and peoples should be able to veto that action if it's going to violate their rights. If they don't give their consent freely and prior to that action happening, it's disingenuous. It violates our rights. Yeah, and so to support or not support, encourage and lobby and advocate and put pressure on states to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples would be a great help. But just for us to have channels of communication with these Indigenous communities and find out what it is they want from us would probably be the simple answer. Changing economics is something we need to prevent even more worse effects of climate crisis. But it's going to take a massive mobilization of the citizenry around the world to do that, because the capitalistic economic system has so much gravity and force and momentum. It's like a train going at speed. You can't just stop. Even if we had the power to stop it, imagine all the damage that would happen to the passengers sitting on the train. They'd be smashed up. You have to slow it down, urgently slow it down, like if it was going to go off a cliff, which it is. The capitalistic economic system is going off the cliff and taking us all with it. So we do have to slow the train down. But it's unfortunately no one's come up with a way to do that overnight. But there has to be mobilization of people, a critical mass of people. So that's something that we really have to focus on, is how do we mobilize the people? How do we get to their hearts and minds that they understand the house is on fire? And yes, when your house is on fire, everyone knows this, metaphor, right? This analogy. You're not just going to go, oh, maybe we should think about doing something. No, you're going to smash your window and you're going to get out of the house. You don't care if you break a few windows to get out. You just got to get out. And that's kind of like, how I think about climate crisis. You're going to have to break some eggs to make an omelette. You're going to have to, dismantle some stuff and get uncomfortable. Some sacrifices will have to be made. There will have to be some collateral damage in moving to a new world, which will not be the great reset of the World Economic Forum, by the way, not that new world. But how about a great reset of the people? How about that? I don't know if people have heard, but the United Nations and the World Economic Forum made an agreement in the last year to rapidly progress the 2030 agenda. And that is not all good, I have to say. So people probably might need to understand that dynamic a bit better and what it means for us in the climate crisis context, because it's just going to mean more growth of the economy. And as we know, we need to degrow if we're going to save this planet, because how many planets worth of consumption now is it estimated humanity is doing? Like 5-7 Earths worth of consumption. We can't keep this up. We can't keep it up. So something's got to give. Yeah, and the monetary system has a lot to do with that. Equitable distribution of wealth is what we need, not more concentration of wealth into the hands of fewer and fewer elites, which is they're all making the decisions about what happens on Earth, and they're destroying our planet. So I hope I touched on something of value for that that question. It's a massive question. I don't have all the answers for that one, unfortunately.
Right. We've got a question here which could take you further in the direction where you just were. We've got a question about what you mean by the 2030 agenda. Is that where you want to go, or do you want to leave that and keep it back?
Yeah, we might have to like bookmark some of these concepts for another webinar so people can really understand. The 2030 agenda is, how would you say? It's a pathway. It's this vision that certain influences in the international space have for the world. If you search it on the internet, you will find it. The problem with the 2030 agenda is it has a bias towards what certain value systems, what is it? Certain value systems that are dominant in the world. And certainly it's not the value system that aligns with Indigenous people's, what did I say, life nurturing principles. It's not aligned with that at all. So in that regard, it's more of what we're getting now, which is destroying the world. And it's certainly, you know, questionable as to whether this 2030 world agenda, which relates to the Great Reset, which is really, I mentioned the World Economic Forum, it's all what they would like to have happen. And it's not democratic. It's an instrument, a collection of ideas, which is influencing state policy around the world. And it's not necessarily what the populations and the citizenry of different countries are, you know, they have any power or influence over to set what happens in their own countries. It's like the global world dominance sort of agenda that people have been talking about for a long time. So there's a bit of this balancing act going on. Who do states really have sovereignty, or is our sovereignty and democracy being diluted by globalistic agendas? That's the question, right? And many of us would look at the world today and say, you know what? I think trade agreements, military activities, wars, you might even think of like China's Belt and Road agenda entering into the Pacific and influencing the power dynamics in the Pacific. Big corporations, now we do know this, right? There are some corporations that have more wealth and power than some countries. That ain't right. And you wonder why the world's going down the googler. Somehow, as populations, as nations of people, we have to get our sovereignty back. We just have to find out how to do that, because we're losing it big time. And yeah, so go look at the 2030 agenda. There is some concerning elements in there, for example, to do with population control. There are elements in there talking about economics, which are now coming to the fore. If anyone knows about digital central bank digital currencies. I would encourage people to go look that up, which is about how you can actually create, and this is happening now. Some countries are piloting this now. You can program currencies so that, for example, if a nation state has a climate policy whereby too much meat is bad, so we want to move to a more plant-based diet, which you would think on the face of it is a good thing to reduce emissions and so on. But imagine if you went to the supermarket, you went to buy a burger of actual meat, and you put your plastic, into the grocery store machine to pay for your meat, and it went, bat, you've gone over your quota of meat. You can't have any more this week. Sorry, go buy some carrots. This is actually something that is on the table now. It's real. If you don't believe it, go and look at what happens in Canada when the people who were protesting against, rightly or wrongly, I'm not saying I'm judging the substantive nature of the protest against the mandates, the COVID vaccination mandates and the lockdowns and stuff, but they did that in Canada, the truckers did, and the government shut down access of those protesters to their bank accounts. I mean, it's here. If you don't have access to money, you're screwed. It's already happening, people.
We've got some more questions stacking up here, Catherine.
Oh, stacking. Excellent.
Can I guide you onto another direction? Coming up on the on Te Reo, we've got questions, like there's a lot of appreciation for your suggestions around that looking into Te Reo and making yourself as bilingual as possible can be helpful. Have you got any suggestions for people on good ways to do that? Anything you want to share on that?
Well, lots really. I mean, admission. So I'm a product of colonization. English is my first language. Te Reo is my second language. And, I consider myself, maybe I'm a bit hard on myself, but I consider myself to be only, intermediate light. I'm not fluent. The thing here is you don't need to be fluent in Te Reo to have an appreciation of core, values concepts associated with our language and our customs and practices. For sure, verse of like internet access to language. There are, I believe, language learning programs, Duolingo, maybe the Rosetta Stone is another platform, but there are platforms out there, I think, now that you can learn Māori language on the internet. You go on Māori television, they've got a back catalogue of soap operas, is that what we call them? In dual language. And they're really excellent to pick up there on, watch the Māori TV with the captions. Books, I mean, you name it, it's out there. I had the opportunity, and this one regret I do have in life. One of my aunties said, girl, you spend 6 months living with me, you'll be fluent in your reo by the time I'm done with you. If anyone has the opportunity to live with a fluent Māori speaker for 6 months, a year, whatever you can do, I would highly recommend you do it. Then you'd have no regrets like I do. Just start a little group in your community. Find out in your hood who's up for that, and just have a cup of tea once a week or something. Hook up with a course. Go to a wānanga. There's several wānanga around the country now. You can do a basic Māori language course, whatever. There's heaps of ways you can pick up some reo. Heaps of ways. Learn waiata. If you like singing, just go find, there's heaps on YouTube. Māori songs, and lots of them come with interpretation. It's such a really good way to learn that. If you like reading the Bible, I'm not religious, but I know some people who have picked up a lot of language, not just Māori language, but languages generally, by reading the Bible and interpreting it. You know, we can get creative, you know. Yeah, lots of
Thank
ways.
you. Now, on a different subject from Kerry, do you have more thoughts you want to share on how things might look practically in Aotearoa in 10 or 20 or 30 years, if we were to get ourselves on the best path we can as far as justice, climate, and the wider issues with the wider taiao? Oh, sorry, I'll read that last bit again. If we were to get ourselves on the best path we can as soon as possible for justice, climate, and the wider taiao, how would you like it to be? How do you think it might be?
Oh man, I'm just going to be efficient. I was going to say lazy, but I switched really quick and I said I'm just going to be efficient. Yeah, this is the thing. We've got to watch our internal language. For as you know, as much as possible, go to the empowering language first. You know, play a game with it. Use empowering language. So I'm going to say I'm going to be efficient. I'm just going to go straight to whatever's in alignment with Te Tiriti, whatever's in alignment with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, standards of human rights, and beyond that, just the basic family of human rights treaties. There's 9 of them. Check them out. There's you know, civic, political, cultural rights. There's women's rights, children's rights. You know, you name it, it's all in there. A world that was congruent and consistent with that would be my utopia. I mean, it ought to be, theoretically, it ought to be doable because states have signed up to this. What's the problem? Yeah, that's my short answer. I'm not sure
Cool.
What other kind of answer you want, because basically that encapsulates it for me. I would say, however, no, one little footnote to that. The international system of human rights isn't necessarily where Indigenous peoples ideally would have it be. Why is that? Because traditionally, Indigenous peoples' value system is obligations and responsibilities based. It's not about my rights, my individual rights, and it's also, you know, about our responsibilities to, you know, our community, our environment, our supernatural ancestors, and all of that. What I discussed. But if we have to talk about it in a rights framework, our rights are more collective than individual. So that's kind of like a difference in the human rights system. They're individual rights based, which is not actually a one-for-one match with where Indigenous peoples are at. But hey, we'll take it because it's, you know, it's the only game in town. Apparently, there's no one's really paying attention to Indigenous peoples. In my personal view, Indigenous peoples are going to save the world. Does anyone remember there was a series some years ago where it was some cheerleader, and it was like the cheerleader's going to save the world. She had, you know, all these people had like supernatural abilities, and the cheerleader somehow was them. Anyway, that's what I think. Indigenous peoples are really going to save the world, but it needs people to sort of come on board. There's the rub.
Okay, I should tell you there's a lot of stroking and appreciation going in and comments as well, which I could read out if you want to hear them, or there are questions interleaved. If you're being efficient, you want to deal with the questions, and we can print out these other praise type comments for you. So from Catherine, here's a question. This is a different Catherine. From my little experience, there is quite a diversity in values and positions among Māori. How do we navigate through such diversity, especially when there are conflictual views, e.g. a Māori-owned company putting extractive profits above the well-being of the whenua or the moana? As an ecologist, it is difficult to agree with extractive businesses, whether it's owned by Indigenous people or tauiwi. I think this possibly highlights a problem, and I've run into this in my life as well, where it becomes very complicated to work out how you can effectively get involved in a supportive way, because there's an inherent conflict in the Māori situation that's very, very tricky as a non-Māori to get involved with. So do you want to hear that question again, or have you got it? Do you want to go there?
That was a statement more than a question, or?
No, it's a question. Well, I guess Catherine's asking if there's any advice you might have about dealing with those kind of problems. That's a bit hard. That's a bit of a hard one. And we get told Pākehā should sort this out for themselves, but you can. This is an issue that can keep people that really do want to help people, want to be on board. It can keep them at arm's length. The difficulties of getting involved with conflict, which is essentially Māori within Māori conflict.
Okay.
That's a bit unfair, maybe.
Hey, no, look, the thing is, I'm going to say the C word. Brace yourself for it. Colonization. I don't know what C word you guys are thinking of. There was a C word I was thinking of. Anyway, colonization. So, like everyone else, Māori people are forced to engage in it. And, because we're talking about other games in town. What's another game in town? Is it donut economics? Is it ecological economics? We've got what we've got right now. And so it's a very, business and enterprise corporations, they are, destroying a lot of our environment and societal value and so on. So to disrupt that is really the question, because until we find a way, and I don't even want to call it an alternate way, because we want to normalize an economic system which works for our planet and people. That should be the norm. And what we've got today should be the alternate that we kick to the curb. So we've got to think about how we're going to do that. And until we do, Māori are going to be engaged in corporate activities that may have some destructive impacts. But if anyone knows anything about the current, the marketplace, it's very difficult it's a bit like going into politics. That's why I'm not really into going into politics, because the culture, once you get into, the beehive, it's very difficult for a person with solid integrity to maintain their integrity once they're in there. It's a bit like, Māori businesses. Once you get into business in the marketplace, you've got to compete. It's, like I say, very patriarchal. And to compete, what do you have to do? You have to make sure your bottom line, or minimize your costs, for example. And to do that, where do businesses go? They tend to go first is the working conditions of the employees. That's really easy. Keep the wages low, and their working conditions not great, because that's just another cost. So there's all these different ways. Or you export your production offshore, and you go to countries where human rights are violated routinely in other countries. Children are making your sneakers, or you're paying people 3 little bits of rice a day or something. The supply chain of business and industry is riddled with human rights violations. So it's like 6 degrees of connection. I won't even say separation. It's like 6 degrees of connection. Māori business and industry, our hands have got blood on us as well. So yeah, it's a systemic problem with the economic system, and I don't know any business or industry, Māori or otherwise, that is protected from it. Yeah, these are big issues that we probably need another webinar to talk about. How are we going to change from the current economic operating system that's destroying the planet to a better one?
Now, a question from...
Sorry.
Let's move on. A question from, not sure, no, from Robin. Following up on meat rationing. I'm not sure if that's a misspelling or not. Rationing has been suggested as a fair way of ensuring access for all to remaining budget of fossil fuels, with an equal reducing share for each adult. Do you think this is a bad thing? Can you suggest an alternative? Ngā mihi nui.
Wow, we got some groovy questions coming in. Not necessarily on Te Tiriti matters specifically, but kind of related. So that's a really good question. Here's the thing about rationing. Why do we ration? One might say, oh, it's because individual people need to consume less of a good, like fuel or meat, whatever, what have you. Here's the thing about that though. It's not an even playing field. Okay. Some people need to be rationed more than other people. If you apply a rationing standard across, the same across everyone in the population, you are going to create inequities. Let me give another example. Who is it that flies around the world the most in their, jets? It's rich people. Hello. So if you say to the whole population, we're going to ration petrol, it's like, hello, wait a minute. You ought to be stopping the wealthy people the most from flying around the world because they're disproportionately emitting more than poor people, right? So on the one hand, yeah, rationing might work, but on the other, if it's calibrated wrong, you will be creating human rights violations. You will be creating more inequity. And this is the devil in the detail with all this climate policy. You must have climate justice, but if you're not going to look at that really carefully, you're just going to screw it up so badly. And that's what you remember in my interview, I said the global South and Indigenous peoples, vulnerable people will be hit first and they'll be hit hardest. So it's a double whammy. If you don't get the policy calibrated right, responding to climate crisis, you're going to create a world of hurt for the 99 percenters, not for the 1% elites. They'll be fine. So, yeah, rationing. Got to think about that one very, very carefully.
We'll put a note in the chat about a petition that's going around the country at the moment related to this, about TEQs, they're called. And there's information about it on our webpage too. With one of the eight actions that we're looking at includes a section on a method of trying to make equitable rationing. Oh, that's right. We've had this discussion, Catherine. I remember now. There's a debate about whether it can be made equitable or not, based on the tradability. Yeah, but I guess you've made the case that tradability is pretty suspect. Moving right on. We're getting lots of smiles in this section from a supportive person. One of those supportive people was our friend Jason, which is great. Cheers, Jason. This could be an appropriate time for me to draw this part of the thing to a close, because we've got about 4 minutes till 8:30, and there's a few advertisements and informations that I need to put out as the MC before we close. So thank you very much, Catherine. I can't thank you enough for the effort you put into making that interview, and for your courage in putting your well-being at risk, really, to stress out again so soon after you got back after an overseas trip. So it's been a pleasure to be involved in that organising of this, and to seeing the listeners and the responses that you've gained. There's been a question, does anyone want to talk about their campaign? So there's an opportunity for that after we'll do a karakia to close. That's going to happen in a minute. And then at that point, people that want to can feel free to leave. And then we might go over to a more plenary view, a view that is more, what do you call it? There's a name for the other view where you can see everybody, and open up the floor a bit and try and facilitate it in a more, in a less controlling way, so that people have an opportunity to speak by putting up their hand. I guess I would suggest for the moment that you do use the putting up the hand will have to be done using the Zoom feature. Good. We have to see how many people are going to stay, but that's the plan from here. But before we move to that, I just want to tell everybody that on the Citizens Assembly development, that there's quite positive things happening in Porirua with the setting up of a treaty-based People's Assembly as a means for the community to communicate with the council. You know, the city council's involved, Ngati Kuri is involved, and a couple of XR people are involved as well. I don't have all the details, I'm afraid, but that's something to look out for. And of course, we've got the XR Whakatū, Extinction Rebellion Whakatū. They had an action just maybe last weekend in the main street of Nelson. Let's hope it's not all washed away right now. Just making the point that about Te Tiriti assemblies, and we're expecting from them some information. Yes, Te Wehi is here. He is here. You're right. We'll invite, if you want to stay. Hopefully, Te Wehi will stay after the close here and tell us about that. Right now. What else is on this list? We also need to let you know that in 2 weeks' time, on the 1st of September, Mike Joy will be talking to us in a more live way, because he hasn't been out of the country. And his topic is, where did I write it down? Peak Everything. I think it's called Peak Everything, and what is the effect of that on food and energy? I haven't got it quite right, but I'll keep going. So you'll be, if we have your email address, you'll be invited to that in the same way as you were invited to this. We won't be using Eventbrite anymore after this, so it remains to be seen whether we'll have an organised way of registering or not. You might have to just register through the Facebook page through an event put on there. That's not certain yet, but please keep an eye out on the Facebook page so you know about the details for how to get in to hear Mike Joy. Now, just need to move something around a bit here. Ways of, if you want to communicate with us by email, there should be, you should find on our webpage a place where you can make contact with us there. If you have trouble with that, most of you on here know one or other of the group. Get hold of the group, one of the people from the group, by any means that you can, because we would like to have the emails addresses of people who are interested in us following them up with emailed newsletters. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this section. I just want to close with a sort of a clearing karakia. So thanks again, everybody. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapu nui. Kia wātia, kia māma te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua I te arataka te takatā. Koia rā e rongo, wakairi ake ki runga, kia tina, tina. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. So that, I'm not quite sure how I think we hand back to you here, Sally.